The ocean on a winter evening has a way of hushing the world. High above the water, the half-moon was faint in the sky, leaving a narrow path of silver over the Pacific waves. Each wave top lifted and dropped with a beat that felt endless, uncaring about the huge war happening on lands far away. There was no noise except for the wind on the water, and even that was just a murmur. For any sailor on duty on the deck of a Japanese warship that evening, it might have felt calm, almost tricking you into feeling safe. But under that shining surface of the sea, a hunter was waiting. The submarine was the USS Archerfish, a boat from the United States Navy. She was 311 feet of welded steel, colored a dull gray. Before we dive in, tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. And if stories of heroes appearing in the darkest hour thrill you, then hit subscribe, because we're just getting started. Her command tower was just a dark shape against the moonlit ocean when she came up. Her periscope and radar antenna hardly broke the surface of the water when she went under. Inside her strong body, the air was stuffy and thick, smelling of oil, sweat, and equipment. Men walked softly around valves, dials, and mapping tables, their voices low, their focus complete. They had been fighting for years, but right then, something felt new. Something huge was about to happen. At the heart of it all was Commander Joseph F. Enright, a 33-year-old officer with dark eyes and a name that had been, until lately, questionable. He had known failure in the past. On a prior command, he had paused at important times and came back from patrol without shooting a single torpedo. For a submarine sailor during a war, a trip like that was more than a letdown. It was a disgrace. Enright had even asked to be replaced, believing his gut feelings had let him down. He carried that wound into every choice he made from then on. This evening, in these dark seas south of Honshu, he planned to make things right. Enright stood at the periscope, one hand resting gently on the handle, the other touching a rosary in his pocket. He was Catholic, and though he wasn't openly religious, he felt better holding that string of beads when his duties felt heavy, and his duties were very heavy. Tonight, somewhere to the north, past the hills of Tokyo Bay, a massive Japanese ship was sailing. The radar man had first spotted it, just a dot, 12 miles out, holding a steady path to the southwest. The contact was big, no doubt about it, and Enright felt deep down that this was not a regular cargo ship. The question was, what was it? The Archerfish had been on rescue duty earlier that night, ready to save American pilots from air raids that never happened. Now free to search, she had found a great prize, though no one on the boat yet understood its true importance. Enright's mind went to the giant Japanese battleships, the Yamato and Musashi, huge vessels that had shaken the oceans. Musashi had been sunk at Leyte Gulf just weeks before, hit by many waves of American bombers. Could Yamato herself be on the move? Or was this something stranger, something new? The submarine shook a little as it changed its path. In the control room, men leaned over the mapping board, drawing the lines of movement, marking new directions with grease pencils. They worked with a quiet speed, knowing that timing and angles meant life or death. A slip-up here would not only mean losing the target, but could bring on an attack from the warships that surely guarded her. For the time being, though, Archerfish stayed back, following on the surface, using the night and the thin clouds to cover her shape. Inside the submarine, life was stressful but orderly. The crew had long ago gotten used to living in small spaces. Torpedo men dozed next to their weapons in the front room. Officers took turns in bunks, and every man knew his job by heart. The air had a steady hum, fans, pumps, the low sound of the diesel engines when on the surface. Men wore sweat-soaked shirts, some wearing only undershirts in the humid rooms. On nights like this, their nerves made every noise louder, the creak of the body as the sea pushed on it, the splash of waves on the bow, the soft buzz of the radar. Each sound was made bigger by hope, and Enright was not going to let hope turn into pausing again. He had made up his mind months before while sitting at a poker game at Midway Naval Base. A senior officer had watched his bold bluffs and said to him, "Joe, would you lead a submarine the way you play cards?" His reply had been simple, yes. That reply had earned him a second try. Now at the periscope, that try was about to be put to the test. What Enright didn't know yet was the size of what was in front of him. The ship he was following was Shinano, the jewel of Japanese shipyards, and at 71,890 tons, fully loaded. She was the biggest aircraft carrier the world had ever known. She had been finished in secret, put into service only days before, and sent out at night with a small crew and unfinished parts. She was meant to be a show of power, of resistance. Instead, she was sailing unaware toward a lone submarine led by a man who needed a second chance as much as the Japanese Navy needed a miracle. The moon vanished for a moment behind some clouds, making the sea darker. In that instant, the men on the Archerfish felt the ocean become even more silent, as if it were holding its breath. Enright looked into the eyepiece again. The outline was faint, but it was there, looming. He saw the guard ships, darker shapes moving through the water around the main ship. A destroyer turned fast, rushing at them, and for a second it looked like the hunter had become the prey. Then, for no clear reason, the destroyer turned away, circled back, and went back to its spot next to its lead ship. The chance was still there. Enright spoke softly to his officers. "Calm but steady. Follow her. Let her zigzag. We'll see where she goes straight." His words were not just commands, but a vow to himself, to his crew, to his career. He would not pause. This time he would go with his gut. He would attack. The clock moved toward midnight. Somewhere up ahead, the largest warship ever built sailed through the dark, not knowing that under the quiet sea, a submarine and its driven captain had her locked in their sights. The scene was ready. The contest of waiting, angles, and luck had started. The year was 1944, and the direction of the Second World War had shifted with a power that could no longer be denied. For Japan, the empire that once covered lands from the cold Aleutians to the hot jungles of Burma, the war was not about getting bigger anymore. It was about staying alive. The empire was on the defense, hit from the sky, choked at sea, and losing blood on its faraway island forts. The Pacific was no longer a huge ditch that protected the Japanese homeland. It had turned into a fighting ground that got smaller with every passing month. American troops had jumped from island to island in a steady push. The Solomons, the Gilberts, the Marshalls, and then the Marianas. Each move brought U.S. troops nearer to Japan's core. With every landing, the Japanese army had to fight from a worse spot, spread thin, with supplies running low and spirits dropping. By the summer of 1944, the fight for the Philippines had started. General Douglas MacArthur, keeping his famous promise, had come back. His soldiers were fighting their way through Leyte and further, while Admiral Chester Nimitz guided the large fleets of the U.S. Pacific Navy in a constant march toward Okinawa. The seas themselves had become unfriendly to Japanese ships. The Imperial Navy had once controlled those waters, but now it was American submarines that were in charge below the waves. These quiet service boats were proving to be terribly good at their job. Submarines like Archerfish had torn Japan's merchant fleet to pieces. Tankers bringing oil from the East Indies were being sunk faster than new ones could be built. Cargo ships carrying food, arms, and materials were simple targets for submarines with patience and torpedoes. By 1944, Japan had lost over half of its merchant ships, and the lack of supplies was becoming a major problem. Factories slowed down, fuel became scarce, and even everyday items were hard to find. The numbers of war had turned harshly against Japan. Where the empire once could replace lost ships and planes, now every ship that sank was a loss that couldn't be replaced. The big shipyards that had made the fleet that attacked Pearl Harbor were now having trouble fixing damaged ships, much less building new ones. Steel was in short supply, skilled men had been called into the army, and American bombing runs were starting to hit factory areas. Above the waves, things were no better. The U.S. Navy had gathered the strongest carrier groups ever seen. The fast carriers of the 3rd and 5th Fleets moved freely across the Pacific, their planes hitting Japanese bases and the home islands themselves. The skies were not safe anymore. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress, with its incredible range, had started daytime bombing raids on Japan's cities. Tokyo and Nagoya were set ablaze by their attacks, and more raids were on the way. The Imperial Navy, once the most advanced and feared power in the Pacific, was now a weak shadow of its old self. Its air force had been wiped out at Midway in 1942. Its battleships had been hurt in the Solomons and the Marianas. And at the huge Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, the biggest sea battle in history, Japan had risked everything it had left in one final bet. The outcome was a total failure. Carriers like Zuikaku, a veteran of Pearl Harbor, were sunk. The powerful battleship Musashi was lost under the non-stop waves of American bombs and torpedoes. And though Yamato, the biggest battleship still sailing, had made it through the fight, she was damaged and had to pull back. The toll on people was just as awful. Japan's skilled pilots, the ones who had carried out the Pearl Harbor attack so perfectly, were almost all gone. The pilots who replaced them were trained in a hurry, often with less than 50 hours of flying time before being sent to fight. American pilots, on the other hand, showed up to the fight with hundreds of hours of practice. The result was a massacre in the sky. Japanese planes were being shot down at rates of 10 to 1, sometimes even higher. Japan was running out of time, running out of ships, and running out of choices. Yet even in this bad situation, the country held on to one final hope, that a strong new weapon could change the tide, if only for a short while. That weapon was not another battleship or a new plane design. It was a ship like nothing the world had seen. A carrier so huge, so heavily protected, and so secret that the Allies had no proof it was even real. Her name was Shinano, after an old Japanese regent. Built from the body of a Yamato-class battleship, she was meant to be safe from harm, a fortress on the sea. Japanese leaders thought that if this carrier could be finished and sent to fight, she might hold up their defense line around the home islands. Maybe she could carry enough planes and special attack weapons to slow the American push, maybe even to challenge the invasion fleets that were definitely coming. The planning behind Shinano showed Japan's changing ideas. The Imperial Navy could no longer hope for big battles where better training and gear would win. Instead, they needed a ship that could live through American air raids, act as a floating station for plane repairs, and carry the new suicide weapons that were becoming a key part of their plan. The Oker rocket-powered kamikaze planes and Shinyo explosive motorboats showed a dark math. That Japanese lives could be exchanged for American ships at good rates. But even as Japan built her, the facts of war closed in. Shipyard men worked in shifts that lasted 16 hours or more. Materials were hard to get, quality went down, and due dates were near. The Shinano's finish was hurried, so hurried that key safety checks were skipped. The Empire needed the ship, and it needed her right away. In Tokyo, leaders held on to false hopes. If Shinano could sail with a full group of planes, she might shoot down lots of B-29s. If she could get to the Philippines, she might mess up MacArthur's landings. If she could just show up off Okinawa or Formosa, her very presence might shake American belief. The war was getting away from them, but maybe, just maybe, one big ship could slow down what was bound to happen. Yet desperation is not the same as strength. Japan was already turning to actions that showed how bad things had become. The kamikaze units were not a sign of power, but of weakness, a sign that normal fighting was no longer an option. Young pilots, some just out of their teens, were told that their greatest duty to the Emperor was to die by crashing their planes into American ships. It was a plan born from hopelessness but described with words of honor. The waters around Japan were not safe anymore. American submarines hunted the coasts without stopping. Groups of 3 or 4 boats would work together to attack convoys, sinking guard ships and merchant boats. In late November, as Shinano got ready to leave her shipyard, many submarines were waiting near the entrance to Tokyo Bay. They had split the sea into patrol areas, with each boat in charge of its own section, all sharing news of contacts to work together on attacks. Most would never find out she was there, but one would, and that one meeting would seal her doom. The bigger strategic situation was plain to anyone looking fairly. Japan had lost the war. The only things left to decide were how long the fighting would go on and how many people would die before it was over. But for those stuck in the machine of war, the sailors, the shipbuilders, the pilots, that kind of clarity was not possible. They kept fighting, building, and hoping because the other choice was too hard to think about. By November 1944, Japan was an empire under attack. Its seas were patrolled by unseen hunters. Its skies were burned by firebombs. Its cities shook with the sureness of invasion. Into that storm sailed Shinano, a giant ship not ready, not tested, and holding the weight of a country's last wishes. And waiting for her, hidden in the night, was a submarine led by a man looking to make things right. Every great warship starts as a sketch on paper, lines on a plan that promise steel, might, and respect. The tale of Shinano started just like that. But her fate would shift more than once before she ever saw the ocean. She was thought up in 1940 at the peak of Japanese naval dreams as the third of the Yamato-class battleships. These were meant to be the biggest, heaviest, most powerfully armed battleships ever made, planned to be better than anything sailing in the American or British navies. Their armor was thicker, their guns were bigger, and their weight was greater. They were signs of an empire that wanted to rule the seas. The Yamato class showed a way of thinking about sea warfare that was decades old. Japanese leaders, knowing their country could never build as much as America, believed in being better in quality. If Japan couldn't make more ships than America, it would make better ships. Each Yamato-class battleship would be equal to 2 or 3 of its American rivals. Their 18.1-inch guns could hit targets from distances where enemy ships couldn't fire back. Their armor could brush off shells that would sink smaller ships. 2 of her sisters were finished to that first design, Yamato and Musashi, each with 9 huge guns that could throw shells weighing nearly 3,000 pounds farther and with more force than any naval gun before them. These shells could go through 16 inches of armor from over 25 miles away. Shinano's foundation was laid down at Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, one of the Empire's great shipyards, with every hope that she would join them in the Pacific as a floating fort. The building started with special events and pride. Shinto priests blessed the spot where she would be built. The emperor himself was told about the work. The best steel was set aside, and the most skilled shipbuilders were given the job. In the first plans, she would weigh 72,000 tons fully loaded, have the same huge guns as her sisters, and travel at 27 knots even with her great size. She was not just a weapon, but a display of Japanese skill. But wars have a way of changing dreams. In June 1942, Japan had a terrible loss at the Battle of Midway. 4 large carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were lost in one day. With them went hundreds of skilled pilots and the main part of Japan's naval air force. That fight changed the power balance in the Pacific for good. Japan could no longer count on its carriers to show its power, as it had in the early winds of 1941 and 1942. The loss at Midway made them rethink their whole naval plan. Aircraft carriers, not battleships, had shown they were the key weapons in modern sea fights. The time of the big gun was over. The time of the airplane had begun. The Navy's leaders looked at Shinano's giant body, still not finished in its dock, and had to make a decision. To finish her as a battleship would be to create another gunship at a time when carriers decided the results of war. To leave her half-done was not an option. Too much had already been put into it. The solution was simple. Shinano would be changed into an aircraft carrier. Not just any carrier, but the biggest carrier the world had ever seen. The change was huge and difficult. The lower body, already made for a battleship's needs, had to be changed for totally different uses. Her armored center, first made to survive huge shell hits, was redone to hold a large hangar deck. Where gun towers would have been, airplane elevators were put in. The top structure was remade, moved to the right side like other carriers. A flight deck 840 feet long and 130 feet wide was built over everything. Unlike other carriers, she would not be made mainly to send out big attack waves. Instead, she was seen as a support carrier, a moving fortress that could shield fleets with her armor, fix planes in battle, and carry suicide planes and motorboats made for special attack jobs. Her hangar could hold 47 planes with room for another 70 in boxes that could be put together when needed. She would be a floating backup, refilling the plane groups of other carriers that had taken losses. This idea showed the new Japanese plan. By 1944, Japan could no longer rely on gathering hundreds of trained pilots for regular battles. The skilled flyers who had carried out the Pearl Harbor attack were almost all gone. The new ones were poorly trained, often with less than 50 hours of flight time. Instead of regular air power, Japan looked for weapons of shock and desperation. Shinano would become their storehouse. The secrecy around her building was like nothing before. Fearing American bombers would wreck the ship before she ever left port, the Navy took amazing steps. The dry dock where Shinano was being built was covered by a huge concrete roof, hiding her from watching eyes in the sky. This roof, held up by giant steel beams, made the building site a huge covered workshop. The men who worked on her were kept inside the yard. They stayed in barracks there, not allowed to leave or talk to the outside world. They were told they would go to prison or worse if they said a word about what they were building. Military police walked the edges. Not one picture of Shinano being built was allowed to leave the yard. Even inside the Imperial Navy, information about Shinano was very limited. Only a few chosen officers were allowed to know her details. Papers talking about her used code names. When she finally came out, she would be a shock not just to the Americans, but even to some of her own people. This much secrecy made its own troubles. Companies bringing materials often didn't know what they were for. Working together between different teams was hard. Errors that might have been found with normal checks were missed. Her design stretched the limits of naval building. With a full weight of 71,190 tons, Shinano was much bigger than any other carrier sailing. Her armored flight deck, not common among carriers, could handle 1,000-pound bombs. Her armored side, up to 8 inches thick at the waterline, gave her a kind of protection not seen in carrier design. Her hangar was split by heavy armor walls meant to stop a single bomb or torpedo from hurting the whole ship. Her engines, 4 steam turbines making 150,000 shaft horsepower, were made to push her at speeds of 27 knots despite her huge size. The defensive weapons were impressive, 16 5-inch dual-purpose guns in 8 twin mounts that could hit both sea and air targets. Over 125 25mm anti-aircraft guns were placed around her body, creating many layers of fire. 12 28-barrel rocket launchers could shoot waves of explosive shells into the sky, making a wall of steel against attacking planes. In idea, she would be almost impossible for planes to get near, let alone attack well. Yet for all this greatness, Shinano was being made in a time of trouble. The men building her were no longer the expert workers who had made Yamato and Musashi. Many skilled shipbuilders had been called into the army. The new workers were draftees, students, even prisoners of war. Quality control, once the pride of Japanese shipbuilding, got worse. Welds that should have been checked with X-rays for problems were only looked at by eye. Gaps that should have been measured in millimeters grew to centimeters. The push to finish her was non-stop. Tokyo said she had to be done by November 1944. Work went on all day and night. Men passed out from tiredness and were taken away, replaced right away by others. The heat inside the covered dock in summer was choking. In winter, workers' hands got numb from the cold. Accidents happened more often. Men fell from platforms, were crushed by moving steel plates, or were knocked out by fumes from welding. Each death was kept quiet. The war work was seen as more important than single lives. Materials were also not as good. The special steel set aside for her armor was sometimes sent to other important projects. Lower quality materials were used instead. Electrical wiring, much of it brought in before the war, could not be replaced now. When materials ran out, makeshift fixes were used. Systems that should have been backups became single spots of failure. The great ship was being held together as much by sheer will as by building skill. Despite these problems, she started to look like a ship. Month by month, her body grew taller. Her flight deck got closer to being done. Her island command structure rose from the right side. To those who saw her, even not finished, she was amazing. Workers would stop their work to just look at the size of what they were making. She was not just a ship. She was a floating town, a tribute to human dreams. On the morning of October 8, 1944, Yokosuka Naval Arsenal was ready for a moment of great success. After 4 years of secret building, Japan's biggest shipbuilding risk was going to enter the water for the first time. The air was full of excitement. This was meant to be more than just a launch. It was to be a sign of Japanese strength, a proof that even with bombings and blockades, the empire could still make amazing things. The day started with a grand ceremony. At sunrise, Shinto priests in white clothes came to perform cleansing rituals. They waved flowing sticks of white paper, said old prayers, and threw salt to clean the ground. An altar was set up near the bow with gifts of rice, fish, and sake put before it. The priests asked the kami, the spirits of water, wind, and steel, to guard the ship and give her a win. High-ranking naval officers showed up in their best uniforms, their chests full of medals. People from the emperor's family were there. Workers, tired from years of hard work, were given new clothes for the day. They stood in straight lines, their pride for a moment stronger than their tiredness. Bands played military tunes. Flags were hung from every spot. The concrete roof that had kept Shinano hidden for so long had been partly taken down, letting streaks of sunlight shine on her body. The plan for the launch was very specific. Dry dock number 6 would be slowly filled with water through controlled valves. As the water level went up, Shinano would lift off her building blocks and float on her own. She would then be led by tugboats to a pier where her final parts would be put on. It was something the shipyard had done hundreds of times. What could go wrong? At 10:30 a.m., the command was given to start filling the dock. Workers turned the valve wheels and seawater started to pour in. At first, everything went as planned. The water rose slowly, inch by inch, climbing up Shinano's body. Onlookers watched with hope. Then, with no warning, a disaster happened. The caisson gate that sealed dry dock number 6 from Tokyo Bay fell apart. The huge steel wall made to keep the ocean out broke under the immense pressure. Instead of a slow filling, a flood of seawater rushed in with a force that couldn't be stopped. The noise was like a clap of thunder, a loud rush that blocked out all other sounds. In just seconds, millions of gallons of water poured into the dock. Shinano, instead of lifting up smoothly, was struck by a wave of water. The huge ship shot forward like a cork pushed out of a bottle, her 70,000 tons of steel moved by the water's power. She hit the far wall of the dock with a loud crash that made the ground tremble. The hit caused shocks through the shipyard. Windows broke a quarter of a mile away. Ropes as thick as a man's arm broke like string. The recoil sent them flying through the air with deadly force. One rope cut off a worker's head. Another crushed 3 men against a crane. The giant ship bounced off the wall and swung to the side, her rear end hitting the dock's side wall. She rocked back and forth, a huge pendulum of ruin, smashing everything in her way. For several long minutes, it was total chaos. Workers ran in fear, some jumping into the rough water to get away from the swinging ship. Others were carried away by the flood. Officers yelled commands that nobody could hear over the noise. The carefully planned event had turned into a nightmare. The band's instruments were all over the place, flags were ripped off, and the Shinto altar was broken into pieces. When the water finally settled and Shinano stopped moving, the damage was looked over. Amazingly, even with all the violence, the ship herself had no major structural damage. Her body had dents and scratches, twisted parts, and broken railings, but she was still sound. The human toll was a different story. 17 workers were dead, and 43 were hurt. Some bodies were never found, either washed out to sea or crushed too badly to be recognized. But maybe the biggest harm was mental. To the Japanese workers and sailors, ships were not just objects. They had spirits, souls that had to be properly respected. A ship whose launch was marked by a disaster was thought to be cursed by the kami. The violent, out-of-control launch was the worst sign possible. The news spread fast through Yokosuka, and then further. Rumors followed wherever Shinano's name was spoken. She killed men before she even left the dock. The ocean itself tried to push her away. The kami have turned their backs on her. Captain Toshio Abe, newly chosen to lead Shinano, tried to stop this kind of talk. A strict, practical officer who had lived through Midway, he had no time for old beliefs. In a talk to the crew, he called the accident unimportant. Steel and engines have no spirit, he said. Order and training win fights, not signs. But even as he said it, he could see the worry in his men's eyes. Sailors are known to believe in superstitions, and Japanese sailors especially so. Many made secret offerings at shrines, asking for protection from the curse they thought was on their ship. The fixes from the launch accident were rushed, just like everything about Shinano had become. New plates were welded over the hurt areas. Bent parts were hammered flat or changed. Paint hid the marks. Within 3 weeks, the outside signs of the disaster were gone, but those who had seen it could not forget. The picture of that huge ship hitting the walls, the cries of crushed workers, the feeling that something basic had gone wrong, these thoughts stayed. Work started again at an even faster speed. The November due date was close, and the accident had wasted valuable time. Safety rules, already weak, were cut back even more. The watertight doors that should have been checked under pressure were only looked at to see if they shut. Electrical systems that should have been checked carefully were given a quick look. The idea seemed to be that if Shinano seemed finished, she was finished. The crew given to her showed this hurry. Usually a carrier's crew would practice together for months before going out. They would drill until every man knew not just his own work, but could also do others' jobs. Damage control, the skill of saving a hurt ship, needed special knowledge. Teams had to work together perfectly, sealing off rooms, running pumps, putting out fires, all while maybe being in the dark with the ship leaning. But Shinano's crew was put together from wherever men could be found, veterans from sunken ships, new members fresh from training, workers taken from regular jobs. They were put together with very little order. Many didn't even speak the same type of Japanese. The officers tried to run drills, but there was not enough time and the crew was too new. When they practiced damage control, there was chaos. Men got lost in the web of hallways. Gear was in the wrong spots. Orders were not understood correctly. Among the crew, the talk of the curse went on. Petty officers said that men were asking for moves, pretending to be sick, even hurting themselves to not sail on Shinano. The ship's religious leader, a Buddhist priest, held blessing after blessing trying to ease fears. But each event seemed to point out the problem instead of fixing it. Why did the ship need so many blessings if everything was fine? November came with a sense of rush. The deadline was not just near. It was here. Ready or not, Shinano had to go. The American submarine danger got worse every day. Spies reported dozens of enemy boats working in Japanese waters. B-29 bombers were flying farther from their bases in the Marianas. It was only a matter of time before they found and wrecked Shinano at her dock. The last weeks of getting ready had a desperate feel. Gear that should have been carefully put in was just thrown on board. Boxes of goods were piled up wherever there was room. The special weapons she was supposed to carry, 50 Oker suicide rocket planes and several Shinyo explosive motorboats, were put into her hangars. These weapons, which were themselves signs of Japan's desperation, seemed like the right things for a desperate ship. On November 11, 1944, Shinano was officially made a part of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The ceremony was quiet compared to the planned greatness of her launch. No bands played. Not many important people came. Captain Abe read the official commands in a dull voice. The rising sun flag was put up on her mast. She was now officially a warship, though not a ready one. The event showed just how unfinished she was. Of her 12 boilers, only 8 were working. This lowered her top speed from the planned 27 knots to about 20 knots. Her radar systems were only partly working. Half of her anti-aircraft guns didn't have enough bullets. The plane elevators that would carry planes from the hangar to the flight deck had never been checked under a full load. Most importantly, many of her watertight doors, the walls that could seal off flooded rooms, had never been tested under pressure. Captain Abe made a list of problems that was 17 pages long. He gave it to the naval bosses with a request to put off sailing until at least the most important fixes could be done. The answer was quick and firm. Shinano would sail on time. The naval leader's thinking was political as much as it was military. News of the supercarrier's existence was getting out. She needed to be shown as a sign of power, not found as a bombed wreck. The sailing commands were clear. Shinano would leave Yokosuka on the night of November 28th, sail south along the coast, and get to Kure Naval Base in the Inland Sea. There, safe from submarines because of narrow channels and from bombers because of the distance, she would finish getting ready. The trip would take only about 20 hours. What could go wrong in 20 hours? The crew got ready with a mix of pride and fear. They were sailing on the world's biggest warship, a marvel of technology. Yet they were also sailing on an unfinished ship with a new crew, many of whom thought she was cursed. Final letters were sent home. Personal things were put away. Some men went to Shinto shrines, leaving gifts and prayers. Others got drunk on sake, trying to forget their worries. The guard for the trip was small. Just 3 destroyers, Isukaze, Yukikaze, and Hamikaze. All 3 were veterans of many fights. Their crews were skilled, but their ships were old. Their radar and sonar systems, hurt in past fights, had been only partly fixed. They would have to depend more on lookouts than on machines. For protecting the world's biggest carrier, it seemed not enough. But every available destroyer was needed somewhere else. The night of November 28, 1944, started with a deceptive quiet. At Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, the huge shape of Shinano got ready to leave. Steam built up in her boilers. Navigation lights blinked on. On her bridge, Captain Abe looked at the maps one last time. The path was simple: south along the coast around the Izu Peninsula, then west to Kure. They would go at night to stay away from American bombers and keep near the shore to limit contact with submarines. At 6 p.m., Shinano's mooring ropes were let go. Tugs pushed her giant body away from the dock. Her propellers started to spin slowly at first, then with more power. The great ship began to move on her own for the first time. In spite of everything, the rushed building, the cursed launch, the incomplete systems, she was amazing. Her body was nearly 900 feet long. Her flight deck was 60 feet above the water. She was bigger than most harbors could hold. She was, by any standard, a triumph of building. The 3 destroyers moved to their guard spots. Isokaze in front, Yukikaze and Hamikaze on the sides. Together, the 4 ships went toward the harbor mouth and the open sea. As they went through the submarine nets that guarded the harbor, some crew members saw what they thought was another bad sign, a dead albatross floating in the water. Its white wings spread out like a sign of surrender. What no one on board knew was that 30 miles to the south, the USS Archerfish was starting her patrol. The submarine had been on rescue duty, set up to save American flyers from a bombing run that had been called off because of the weather. Now free to hunt, Commander Enright had brought his boat to the surface to charge batteries and get fresh air. The night was ideal for submarine work, dark enough to hide their low shape, calm enough for good sound, with just enough moon to see targets. At 8:48 p.m., Archerfish's radar man called out, "Contact! Bearing 020, range 12 miles. The dot on the radar screen was big, steady, and heading southwest at about 20 knots. Enright ran to the bridge, lifting his binoculars. On the horizon, just barely seeable, he could see a dark shape and the smaller shapes of guard ships. His heart beat faster. This was not a merchant ship. The size, the speed, the guards, everything pointed to a major warship. "Battle stations," Enright said calmly. All through the submarine, men went to their posts with smooth skill. In the front torpedo room, crews looked over their weapons. In the control room, map teams got their charts and calculating tools ready. The hunt had started. Enright had an instant problem. The target was going at 20 knots. Archerfish's top surface speed was 19 knots. In theory, the submarine could not catch its target. But Enright knew that Japanese ships often zigzagged to avoid submarines, and those course changes would slow them down. If he could guess the pattern and cut corners, he might be able to get closer. For the next hour, Archerfish chased at full speed, her 4 diesel engines working hard. The submarine shook with the effort, her body cutting through the waves, spray splashing over her bow. Below, engineers got every last bit of power from the engines. The temperature in the engine room went past 120 degrees Celsius. Men worked in shifts, running to the top to get fresh air before going back to their posts. On Shinano's bridge, radar men spotted the American submarine almost right away. The gear might have been partly working, but it was good enough to see a surface contact from several miles away. Captain Abe got the report with a grim feeling of rightness. He had expected submarines. The waters of Japan were full of them, but he had ways to handle this danger. "Signal the escorts," he commanded. "Enemy submarine bearing 170, distance 8,000 meters. Abe's battle situation was tricky. His ship, even with her size, was at risk. She had no planes to spot submarines. Her own sonar was not working yet. She relied completely on her guard ships for safety, and he knew their skills were not great. The destroyer's sonar had been hurt in past fights and fixed with low-quality parts. Their depth charge racks were only partly full. Supplies were low everywhere. On top of that, Abe had a tough choice. If he told the destroyers to go after the submarine, they would have to leave Shinano's side, possibly leaving her open to other submarines that might be hiding. American wolf packs often worked with one boat showing itself to pull away guards while others went in for the attack. But if he kept the destroyers near, the trailing submarine could follow them, sending their location to other boats or planes. Abe picked what seemed like the safe path. He would keep his guards close and use speed and zigzag moves to get away. "Start zigzag pattern number 7, he ordered. The wheel turned, and Shinano's huge body started a series of course changes. 45 degrees to the left, hold for 10 minutes. 60 degrees to the right, hold for 8 minutes. Back to the main course for 15 minutes, then start over. The zigzag was a common anti-submarine move, but it had its problems. Each turn lost speed and distance. What should have been a 20-hour trip would now be longer. Fuel use went up, and most importantly, the pattern could be figured out and guessed by a skilled submarine leader, which is just what Enright was doing. In Archerfish's control room, the map team followed each of Shinano's course changes. Lieutenant Commander Robert Bob Jablinski, the second in command, leaned over the chart table, measuring angles and times. "She's using a standard pattern," he said. "If we cut across her turns, we can get closer." It turned into a deadly game of angles. Shinano would turn away, making the distance bigger. Archerfish would cut the corner, making it smaller again. The submarine couldn't match the carrier's straight-line speed, but by taking shorter paths, she could stay with her. It took careful math and strong nerves. One wrong calculation and they would lose the target. One spotting by the destroyers, and they would face a storm of depth charges. As the chase went on into the night, Shinano's incomplete state started to show. At 11 p.m., a bearing on the right side inner propeller shaft started to get too hot. The massive shaft, spinning at high speed, created heat that the bearing couldn't handle. Temperature dials climbed into the red. The engineering officer had a terrible choice: keep going and risk a huge failure, or slow down and maybe get caught by the submarine. He decided to lower the speed on that shaft. Shinano's speed fell from 20 knots to 18. The change seemed small, but it was key. Now Archerfish could not just stay with her, but actually get closer. On the submarine, the sonar man reported the change in the target's engine noise. "She's slowing down," he said. Enright allowed himself a small smile. The angles of the hunt had changed in his favor. But Shinano's problems were just starting. The fast zigzagging, along with her incomplete build, put pressure on systems all over the ship. Electrical connections put in quickly started to fail. Lights blinked in some rooms. Air fans stopped. The temperature on the lower decks, already warm, became unbearable. Men working in the engine rooms had to be switched every 20 minutes to avoid heat sickness. More seriously, the constant course changes made the ship roll and bend in ways her unfinished structure was not ready for. Seams that had not been welded well started to come apart. Not enough to cause a big flood right away, but enough to let water in. Water started to gather in some of the lower rooms. Pumps were turned on to handle it, but some pumps broke. They had never been properly checked, and now, under real use, their problems showed up. On the bridge, Captain Abe got report after report of mechanical problems. Each one was small on its own, but together they showed a ship falling apart under pressure. He had a painful decision to make. He could slow down more, carefully bringing his ship to port, but making her an easier target, or he could keep up the speed and risk worse breakdowns. He chose a middle path, lowering the speed to 16 knots and making the zigzag pattern less sharp. By 2 a.m. on November 29th, the deadly chase had gone on for over 5 hours. Archerfish had gotten within 7,000 yards of her target, still too far for a torpedo attack, but close enough to keep a solid track. The submarine's crew was tired but excited. They could feel they were getting closer to their target. Enright looked at the tracking information with deep focus. Shinano's pattern was becoming clear. Even with the zigzags, she kept coming back to a main course of 210 degrees southwest toward Cure. If he could get Archerfish ahead of that path, if he could guess when she would hold that course, he would get his chance. "Take her down to radar depth," he commanded. The submarine went under the surface, leaving only her radar antenna above the water. This slowed her down but made her much harder to see. Now she was truly a hunter in the dark, unseen but watching. On Shinano, the feeling was getting more tense. The submarine had been following them for hours. Why hadn't it attacked? Why hadn't it been scared off? Some officers thought it was calling in other boats, that they were being pushed into a trap. Captain Abe brushed off these ideas, but in private he wondered. American submarine methods had changed during the war. They were more forceful now, more coordinated. At 2:56 a.m., fate stepped in. Isokaze, the lead destroyer, saw what her lookouts thought was a periscope off the right bow. Without waiting for commands, her captain sped up and rushed toward the contact. The destroyer's bow wave turned white in the dark as she sped up to 35 knots. On Archerfish, the sonar man's voice got louder with worry. "High-speed screws coming. Destroyer bearing 340, getting closer." Enright had only seconds to choose: dive deep and likely lose his target for good, or stay at his depth and risk being seen. He chose to dive, but only to 150 feet, shallow enough to come up again quickly. "Prepare for silent running," he commanded. Prepare for depth charge. The destroyer went right over them, its propellers making a loud noise through the water. Every man on Archerfish held his breath, waiting for the splash of depth charges, but nothing came. Isokazi had lost the contact and, more importantly, had broken Captain Abe's orders to stay in formation. A sharp signal from Shinano's bridge told her to get back in line. The moment Isakazi turned back, Enright brought Archerfish back to periscope depth. Shinano was still there, still on course, now only 4,000 yards away. The chance he had been waiting for all night was here. At 3:15 a.m., everything came together. Shinano straightened out on her main course of 210 degrees. She was sideways to Archerfish. Range 400 yards, speed 16 knots. In submarine fighting, it was the ideal situation. Close enough for a good shot, angled for the biggest target area, slow enough for a sure hit. Enright made his last checks through the periscope. The carrier filled his sight, huge, bigger than anything he had ever seen. Her flight deck looked like a cliff. Her island structure rose like a building. He could see lights in some of her windows, the shadows of her guards, the white water at her bow. He drew a quick picture, noting her strange rounded bow, not like any carrier in the guidebooks. "Final bearing and shoot," he commanded. "Get all tubes ready." In the front torpedo room, 6 Mark 14 torpedoes were set. These weapons had been a problem earlier in the war, with bad fuses and running depths, but the issues had been solved. Now they were trustworthy ship killers, each with 600 pounds of Torpex explosive. "Set depth 10 feet, Enright ordered. It was unusually shallow, but he recalled a tip from a senior officer about hitting carriers high on the side, where the damage would affect their balance, not just cause flooding. The fire control team did their final math. Target speed, angle, distance. All were put into the torpedo data computer, a mechanical device that found the right firing angle. The result was checked and checked again. There would not be a second try. "Fire 1. The submarine shook as the first torpedo shot out of its tube. A rush of compressed air pushed the weapon out, and it immediately sprang to life, its propellers spinning, pushing it toward the target at 46 knots. "Fire 2. 8 seconds between shots, giving each torpedo time to get clear before the next was sent. "Fire 3. Fire 4. Fire 5. Fire 6. In less than a minute, 6 death sentences were speeding through the water toward Shinano. The torpedoes ran perfectly, just as they were meant to. Their trails, hardly visible in the dark, made straight lines toward the carrier's side. On Shinano's bridge, lookouts saw the trails too late. "Torpedoes starboard!" was the shout. Captain Abe ordered a full turn, but the carrier's huge body turned slowly. She had just started her turn when the first torpedo hit. The blast was huge. A pillar of water shot up next to the ship, higher than the flight deck. The ship lurched to the left from the hit. Before the crew could do anything, the second torpedo hit, then the third, then the fourth. 4 hits in less than 30 seconds, all on the right side, all between the bow and the island structure. The first torpedo hit at frame 104, near a plane fuel tank that was luckily empty. The blast ripped a 20-foot wide hole in the ship, flooding nearby rooms right away. The second hit frame 142, wrecking the starboard outer engine room. Men on duty there were killed instantly as seawater and very hot steam filled the area. The third torpedo hit frame 166, opening the number 3 fire room to the sea. The fourth hit frame 190, breaking another fuel tank and sending oil pouring through hallways. For a second, those on Shinano's bridge could hardly understand what had just happened. The ship shook with each hit, but she was so big that the torpedoes seemed almost small. Captain Abe's first thought was that she could handle this damage. After all, she had been built with a battleship's armor, made to survive many torpedo hits. But below decks, a disaster was starting. The incomplete build that had been a problem for Shinano now became deadly. Watertight doors that had never been checked failed right away. Some got stuck shut, trapping men in flooding rooms. Others would not close at all. Seams that had been welded in a hurry split open under the pressure. Electrical panels, wet with seawater, short-circuited in bursts of sparks. The damage control teams did what they could, but they were in a fight they couldn't win. The men had never practiced together as a team. Orders were mixed up and conflicting. Some teams rushed to flood balancing rooms on the left side to fix the lean. Others tried to pump water out of flooded areas. The two actions worked against each other. In the engine rooms, the situation was bad. The starboard engine rooms were flooding fast. Engineers worked in rising water, trying to keep power going to the pumps. When water got to the electrical panels, bursts of sparks made them back away. One by one, the starboard engines stopped. The lean got worse and worse, 5 degrees, then 10, then 13. On the flight deck, planes and gear started to slide. Sailors made human chains trying to tie down loose things, but it was no use. A fuel truck broke free and smashed into the island structure. Boxes of bullets fell into the sea. Captain Abe stayed perfectly calm on the bridge. He ordered counter-flooding to fix the lean. He set a course for the closest land, hoping to run the ship aground. He sent messages to naval headquarters. Shinano torpedoed. Position 32 degrees 16 north, 137 to 46 east, trying to get to shore. But even as he gave these orders, he must have known the reality. The news from below was all bad. The flooding was out of control. The pumps could not keep up. Half the crew did not know their damage control posts. The ship was dying. Back on Archerfish, Enright had taken the submarine deep right after firing. Now came the most risky time for any submarine, the counterattack. Above them, Japanese destroyers were rushing back and forth, their sonar pinging, their crews getting depth charges ready. 400 feet, Enright ordered. Rig for silent running. The submarine went down into the darker waters. Every man on board was silent, breathing quietly. They could hear the destroyers above, the high-pitched whine of propellers, the ping of active sonar, the splash of depth charges hitting the water. The first set exploded, 5 charges going off one after another. The submarine shook. Light bulbs broke. Cork insulation fell from the ceiling, but the blasts were far away, at least 500 yards. The Japanese sonar, damaged and not well kept, could not get a good fix on the submarine. More charges came, 14 in all. Each blast sent shock waves through the water, shaking the submarine, but none were close enough to cause real damage. After an hour, the sounds above faded. The destroyers had stopped the hunt and gone back to their dying lead ship. When Enright finally brought Archerfish back to periscope depth at sunrise, the horizon was clear. Whatever had happened to the giant carrier, she was gone. As the sun came up on November 29th, Shinano was in her last moments. The lean had grown to 20 degrees. Walking on the slanted decks was becoming impossible. Men used ropes to pull themselves up the tilted surfaces. On the hangar deck, the Oker suicide planes had broken free, sliding into each other, their unstable rocket fuel making a huge fire risk. The flooding had gone far past the first torpedo damage. This was what naval builders called progressive flooding. Water finding ways through doors, vents, and cable paths, any opening, spreading like a disease through the ship. Rooms that should have been dry were now filling. The weight of the water, thousands of tons of it, was pulling Shinano down. Captain Abe made one last try to save his ship. He ordered all engines full ahead, trying to push Shinano toward the shore. But with only the port engines working, the ship could barely go 10 knots. She was moving in circles, her rudder unable to fix the unbalanced push. At 8:30 a.m., Abe gave the emergency signal, "Prepare to abandon ship." It was not yet a command to leave, but a warning to get ready. Sailors started to gather on the flight deck, helping wounded crewmates up from below. Life jackets were handed out. The destroyers got closer, getting ready to pick up survivors. Below decks, acts of courage and sadness took place. Engineers stayed at their jobs, keeping the lights on and the pumps going until water forced them out. Medical officers worked in leaning sick bays, trying to get patients out. In one flooded room, 30 men were stuck behind a jammed door. Their banging could be heard for an hour before it ceased. The end came suddenly. At 10:18 a.m., the lean quickly jumped to 35 degrees. Gear, planes, and men started sliding without control down the flight deck into the ocean. The command came, "All hands abandon ship." But for many, it was too late. The lean got so bad so fast that hundreds were trapped inside. Others trying to climb the slanted deck lost their hold and fell. Some jumped from the flight deck, a 60-foot fall that killed many when they hit the water. Captain Abe stayed on the bridge. As was custom, he would sink with his ship. He tied himself to the wheel, set on keeping his dignity until the end. Around him, his top officers did the same. They sang the national song as the water came up around them. At 10:55 a.m., Shinano turned over. Her flight deck tilted past straight up. Then she rolled all the way over. For a second, her huge body was seen, barnacles and red anti-rust paint shining in the morning light. Then, with a huge roar of air escaping, she sank below the surface. The largest warship in the world had lasted just 17 hours at sea. The ocean where Shinano went down was filled with wreckage and desperate men. Over 2,000 had been on board. Now hundreds fought in the oil-covered water. The 3 destroyers moved through them, picking up survivors. But the rescue was not for everyone. Naval custom said that officers should be saved first. Some destroyer captains, made tough by war, would not pick up men who were panicking. "Save only the brave," one captain told his crew. The result was one tragedy after another. Men who had lived through the sinking drowned while rescue ships were in sight. Others, covered in oil, were too slick to hold on to and slipped under the waves. The winter sea was cold. Hypothermia took those who were not picked up fast. When the rescue was over, 180 men had been saved. The other 1435, including Captain Abe and most of his top officers, were dead. It was one of the biggest losses of life in a single ship sinking during the Pacific War. For Japan, the loss was a disaster, but it had to be kept secret. Shinano had been a national secret. Her loss would stay one. Survivors were made to swear they would not tell. Families of the dead were told only that their loved ones had died in service, not where or how. The official papers were locked away. To the Japanese people, Shinano had never been real, but secrets are hard to keep in a war. American codebreakers, reading captured messages, found out about the sinking in days. The name Shinano showed up in decoded messages along with her location when she was torpedoed. Intelligence officers were confused. They had no record of a ship with that name. What had Archerfish sunk? When Enright turned in his patrol report in December saying he had sunk a carrier of a size never seen before, he was not believed. Navy intelligence said that no such carrier existed. The best they would give him credit for was a 28,000-ton carrier. Still a big deal, but much less than the truth. Only after the war, when American officials got to see Japanese records, was the truth known. Shinano had weighed 71,290 tons fully loaded. She was, in fact, the largest carrier ever built at that time and is still the largest warship ever sunk by a submarine. Enright's gut feelings had been right, and he had proven himself. The story of Shinano's single trip has lessons that go beyond the events of November 1944. It is a story of pride and humbleness, of big dreams ruined by basic mistakes, of how the smallest hunter can bring down the biggest prey if things line up just right. For Japan, Shinano stood for the failure of the one big weapon idea. Throughout the war, Japanese leaders had looked for single wonder weapons, super battleships, divine wind attacks, miracle carriers. But wars are won by systems, not by symbols. While Japan built one huge carrier, America built dozens of smaller ones. While Japan sent unfinished ships out to sea, America took the time to train crews well. The result was certain. The technical lessons were just as plain. Size without trustworthiness is a weakness. Armor without good damage control is a false sense of safety. A ship's power is not just in its steel, but in the training of its crew, the quality of its build, the soundness of every weld and seal. Shinano failed not because her design was bad, but because she was not finished. For the submarine force, the sinking proved their war of wearing down the enemy. Submarines, fairly cheap and with crews of less than 100 men, could wreck capital ships worth thousands of times more. The Silent Service had shown it could attack anywhere, anytime, against any target. The time of the submarine as a strategic weapon had really started. Commander Enright's personal path from failure to success was talked about all through the Navy. His story showed that one mistake does not have to ruin a career, that sticking with it and being brave could beat past errors. He had faced his own fears and won. The Navy Cross he got was not just for sinking Shinano, but for the will to stay in the fight after earlier losses. The human toll is a sad part of the story. Over 1,400 Japanese sailors died, many of them men who had been forced to join and had never wanted to go to war. They died stuck in flooding rooms, thrown from tilting decks, or left in cold water. Their sacrifice was for nothing. Shinano never sent out a plane in a fight, never guarded the homeland, never made up for the resources used to build her. Today, Shinano lies in 4,000 meters of water off Cape Omaezaki. She is upside down, her flight deck deep in the mud. her body slowly caving in under the pressure of the deep and time. She is a grave for the men who died with her, and a reminder of a time when countries thought that bigger was better, that one perfect weapon could fix everything. Modern naval leaders study Shinano as a warning. In a time of nuclear carriers and ballistic missile submarines, the lessons are still important. Complicated things require skill. Size needs support. No ship, no matter how strong, is more powerful than the system that builds, keeps up, and runs it. The sinking also shows the part of luck in war. If Shinano had sailed a day earlier or later, if Archer fish had been sent somewhere else, if the torpedoes had run deep instead of shallow, things would be different. War is not just about plans and technology, but also about chance and timing. On that November night in 1944, all the pieces lined up perfectly for Archer fish and terribly for Shinano. In the years after the war, the story of Shinano and Archer fish became a legend in Navy groups. Authors wrote books, and historians looked at the fight. Veterans told their stories. Each telling added new facts, fixed mistakes, and built the story that we know today. Commander Enright went on to have a good naval career, retiring as a rear admiral. He didn't often talk in public about the sinking, keeping the quiet, professional manner of the submarine service. When asked about that night, he would just say, "We did our job. The torpedoes worked. We were lucky." But those who knew him knew that it meant everything. The proof of his courage, the sign that he deserved to be in charge, the second chance that he had taken. The crew of Archer fish had reunions for many years. They would get together, these older men who had once been young sailors, and think about their moment of triumph. They told stories of the long chase, the stress of the approach, the boom of the torpedoes hitting their mark. But they also thought of Shinano's crew, fellow sailors who had died doing their job. War had made them foes. Time made them all just men who had served at sea. Some survivors of Shinano also shared their stories after the secrecy was finally over. They talked about the chaos, the fear, the sight of their great ship turning over and sinking. They remembered Captain Abe's last moments, standing straight as the water rose. They remembered crewmates who had helped them get out of flooding rooms, who had given away life jackets, who had pushed others to safety before being pulled under themselves. In Japan, Shinano became a symbol of the war's final stage. Big actions that did nothing, magnificent failures that only made the suffering worse. She stood for the danger of believing your own stories, of mixing up looks with reality, of rushing toward a disaster instead of admitting defeat. For America, the sinking backed up the democratic idea of sea warfare, that 80 men in a submarine could beat thousands in a carrier, that patience and skill could win against size and armor. It was David and Goliath written in steel and torpedoes, a proof that in war, the smallest group could win a strategic victory. The wreck of Shinano was found in 2019 by deep-sea explorers. The pictures they brought back showed a ship in surprisingly good shape despite decades under the water. Her body, built to battleship rules, had withstood the pressure that would have smashed smaller ships. But she lies upside down, her planned glory forever buried in the ocean floor, a monument to a dream that was bigger than what could be done. Today, as countries again race to build the biggest, most powerful warships, Shinano's story is still meaningful. Technology gets better, but the human problems that doomed her are still around. Ships are still built in a hurry. Crews still sail without enough training. Leaders still think that one amazing weapon can change everything. The ghost of Shinano warns against such pride. The final lesson might be the most common one, that in war, as in life, the race is not always won by the fast, nor the battle by the strong. Sometimes patience wins over power. Sometimes the hunter becomes the hunted. Sometimes a single night's action can be remembered through history, teaching future generations about courage, foolishness, and the small space between winning and losing. On that November night in 1944, two ships met in the darkness of the Pacific. One was the largest of its kind ever built, the other a normal submarine with no special features. When the sun came up, only one was left. That is how war at sea is, sudden, clear, and final. The ocean does not favor size or strength. It takes all in the same way, keeping its secrets in the dark depths where Shinano still lies. The largest warship ever sunk by a submarine, a giant brought down by a hunter she never really saw.